Chapter 12. Sir Montague kept Alice waiting for over an hour before deigning to receive her. Halt and Alice waited in the anteroom to Montague's office. Halt stood to one side, leaning impassively on his longbow. Montague was an oaf, he thought. As a courier on official business, Alice should have been greeted without delay. Obviously aware of her youth, the master of Cobram Keep was attempting to assert his own importance by treating her as an everyday messenger. He watched the girl approvingly as she sat, straight-backed and erect, in one of the hard chairs in the anteroom. She appeared calm and unflustered in spite of the insult she was being offered. She had changed from her riding clothes when they were a few kilometers from the castle, and she was now dressed in the simple but elegant white gown of a courier. The bronze laurel branch pin, the symbol of her authority, fastened a short blue cape at her right shoulder. For his part, Halt had left his distinctive mottled ranger's cloak folded on the pommel of Abelard's saddle. His longbow and quiver, however, he retained. He never went anywhere without them. Alice glanced up, and he nodded, almost imperceptibly, to her. "Don't let them make you angry." She returned the nod, acknowledging the message. Her hands, which were clenched into fists on her knees, slowly relaxed as she took several deep breaths. "This girl is very good," Halt thought. Montague's secretary had obviously been well briefed by his master. After peremptorily waving Alice to a chair and leaving Halt to stand, he had busied himself with paperwork and resolutely ignored them, rising several times to take items into the inner office. Finally, as the sound of a small bell tinkling from beyond the door, he looked up and gestured toward the office. "You can go in now," he said disinterestedly. Alice frowned slightly. Protocol dictated that a courier should be properly announced, but the man obviously had no intention of doing so. She rose gracefully and moved toward the door, Halt following. That got the secretary's attention. "You can wait here, Forrester," he said rudely. Without the cloak, there was little to distinguish Halt from a yeoman. He was dressed in simple brown leggings, soft leather boots, and a green surcoat. The double-knife scabbard had apparently escaped the secretary's notice, or perhaps he didn't realize its significance. "He's with me," Alice said. The unmistakable tone of authority in her voice stopped the man cold. He hesitated, then rose from behind the desk and moved toward Halt. "Very well, but you'd better leave that bow with me," he said, without quite the certainty that he had displayed earlier. He held out his hand for the bow, then met Halt's eyes. He saw something very dangerous there, and he actually flinched. All right, keep it if you must," he muttered. He backed away, more than a little flustered, retreating behind the secure bulk of his desk. Halt opened the door for Alice, then followed her as she entered the office. Montague of Cobram was seated at a large oaken table that served as a desk. He was studying a letter and didn't look up from it as Alice approached. Halt was willing to bet that the letter was about something totally unimportant. The man was playing silly mind games, he thought. But Alice was up to the challenge. She stepped forward and produced a heavy scroll from her sleeve, slapping it briskly down on the table before Montague. He started in surprise, looking up. Halt hid a smile. "Alice Mainwaring, Sir Montague, courier from Redmont Castle. My credentials." Montague wasn't just an oaf, Halt thought. He was a fop as well. His satin doublet was formed in alternating quarters of scarlet and gold. His reddish-blond hair was left in overlong curls, framing a somewhat chubby face with slightly bulging blue eyes and a petulant mouth. He was an average height, but of somewhat more than average weight. He could be passably handsome, Halt supposed, if he could shed a few kilos in weight, but the man obviously liked to indulge himself. He recovered now from his momentary surprise and leaned back in his chair, adopting a languid, slightly disapproving tone. "Good heavens, girl, you can't come in here throwing your credentials on the desk like that. Don't they teach you good manners at Redmont Castle these days?" He looked distastefully at the scroll and shoved it to one side. "They teach protocol, Sir Montague," Alice replied very evenly, "and it requires that you examine and acknowledge my credentials before we proceed." Yes, Montague said, waving a dismissive hand at her scroll. Take it as read, take it as read. Now, girl, what brings you here? Halt interjected quietly. The correct form of address, Sir Montague, is Lady Alice. Montague looked at Halt in genuine surprise, as if he considered him some lower form of life who lacked the ability of speech. "Is that so, Forester?" he said. "And what might your name be?" Alice went to speak, but a warning glance from Halt stopped her. He replied, still in the same quiet tone, "Some people call me Arete, Sir Montague. It's Gallican," he added mildly. Montague raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Gallican, you say? How exotic! Well, Master Arete, perhaps you could leave the talking to me and young Alice here. Would that suit you?" Halt shrugged, and Montague took the movement for assent. "Wonderful." Then, dismissing Halt, he turned his attention back to Alice. "So, sweetheart, what do you have for me? A letter, perhaps? Some self-important note from fat Baron Errold, I'll be bound." There were 2 small spots of color on Alice's cheeks, the only outward sign of the anger that was building up inside her at the man's off-handed manner. She produced Nigel's heavy linen envelope from the satchel she wore at her side, and offered it across the desk. "I have an official legal position prepared under Baron Errold's seal. He requests that you study it." Montague made no move to take the letter. "Set it down. I'll look at it when I have the time." "The Baron requests that you look at it now, sir, and give me your answer." Montague rolled his eyes to heaven and took the envelope. "Oh, very well, if it will make you happy." He sliced the envelope and took out the sheet of parchment inside it, skimming through it, muttering to himself, "Yes, yes, seen it, heard it before. Nonsense, rubbish, nonsense." Then he set the page down and pushed it away from him, shaking his head wearily. "When will you people learn? You can send me all the letters you like. The fact remains, Cobram is an independent hold, owing no allegiance to the Redmount Fife. The treaty makes that very clear." "I am instructed to draw your attention to items 3, 5 in the letter, sir, and the paragraph 9 as well. They make it quite clear that the wording of the treaty is faulty, and your claim to independence is totally spurious," Alice replied. And now, for the first time, Montague shed the air of world-weariness that he'd assumed, and stood angrily. "Spurious?" he shouted. "Spurious? Who the devil are you, a little girl in a grown-up's dress, to come in here insulting me and saying my claim is spurious? How dare you?" Alice stood her ground, unmoved by his sudden anger. "I repeat, sir, you are requested to read those items," she said quietly. Instead, Montague threw the letter down on the desk between them. "And I refuse," he shouted. Then his eyes narrowed. "I know who's behind this. I see the hand of that sour-faced shrew, Lady Pauline, here." Now Alice's own anger flared. "You will speak respectfully of Lady Pauline, sir," she warned him. But Montague was too angry to stop. "I'll speak of her all right. I'll tell you this. She's a woman meddling in a man's world, where she has no place. She should have found a husband years ago and raised a brood of squalling babies. Surely there's a deaf and half-blind man somewhere who would have taken her." "Sir," said Alice, her own voice rising, "you are going too far." "Is that right, sweetheart?" Montague replied sarcastically. "Well, let me give you some advice. Get away from that shrill, pinch-faced witch while you still have the time. Find a husband and learn to cook. That's all women are good for, girl, cooking and raising babies." Halt stepped forward before Alice could reply. "The correct form of address," he repeated quietly, "is not girl or sweetheart. It's Lady Alice. You will show respect for the laurel branch that this courier wears, and you will show respect for Lady Pauline as well." For a moment, Montague was too startled to reply. First a girl, now a common forester, had told him how to behave. "Oh, is that so?" he raged. I'll show you respect." He picked up the letter and tore it in half. Then he did the same to the scroll bearing Alyssa's credentials. "There's my respect. Now get out." Very carefully, Halt set his longbow to one side, leaning it against a chair. Alyssa raised a warning hand. "Halt, don't get into trouble on my behalf," she said. But Halt looked at her and shook his head. "Lady Alyssa, this fop has insulted you, your baron, your mentor, and the diplomatic corps as a whole. He has shown absolute disregard for the laurel branch you wear, and by destroying your credentials, he has committed a crime that warrants a jail term." Alyssa considered his words for a second or two. Then she nodded. Montague had been more than rude to her. His behavior was totally beyond acceptance. "You're right," she said. "Carry on." But Montague had heard nothing after the word halt. The entire kingdom knew the legendary ranger's reputation, and the keeper of Cobram paled now and stepped back from the grim-faced figure as he came toward him. "But you said your name was—" He struggled to remember it. Halt smiled at him. It was the smile of a wolf. "Arrêté. Yes, well, more correctly, arrêté. It's Gallican for halt. My pronunciation has never been good." His hand shot forward and locked the scarlet and gold collar of the other man's doublet. The satin tore momentarily, then Halt gained a firmer grip and dragged the struggling knight across the table toward him. Montague was taller and heavier than Halt, but Halt's hands, arms, shoulders, and back were conditioned by years of drawing the massive longbow with its pull weight of 60 kilos. The thousands of arrows he had shot over and over again had turned his muscles into steel cord. Montague was dragged off his feet, hoisted across his own desk. "The question is," said Halt, glancing at Alyssa, "what should we do with him?" She hesitated. Then that wonderful smile spread over her face. "I wonder," she said, "does this castle have a moat?" A group of servants were busy emptying the privy buckets into the moat when they were startled by a sudden drawn-out cry. They looked up in time to see a scarlet and gold-clad figure sail out of a first-story window, turn over once, and then land with an enormous splash in the dark, rancid waters. They shrugged and went back to work. "I suppose I'll be in trouble again now," Halt said as they were riding home. Alyssa glanced at him. He didn't look very repentant. "I doubt it," she said. "Once people hear my report, I should think they'll say Montague got off lightly. After all, phrases like Fat Baron Errol and Sour-faced Shrew don't exactly endear him to Baron Errol or Lady Pauline. He did sign an acceptance of the letter in the end. As an official courier on this mission, I thank you for your service." He bowed slightly from the saddle. "It's been a pleasure working with you," he said, and they rode in companionable silence for a while. "I suppose you'll be leaving with the army soon?" she said after a few minutes, and when Halt nodded, she continued, "I'll miss you. However, how I will ever carry out diplomatic missions without someone to throw unpleasant nobles out the window, I'll never know." "I'll miss you, too," Halt smiled, and he realized that he had meant it. He enjoyed being around young people, enjoyed their energy, their freshness, their idealism. "You're a good influence on a jaded, old, bad-tempered ranger." "You'll have Will back to keep you busy soon," she said. "You really miss him, don't you?" The ranger nodded. "More than I realized," he said. Alyssa urged her horse close beside him and leaned over to kiss him on the cheek. "That's for Will when you see him." A ghost of a smile touched Halt's face. "You'll understand if I don't pass it on to him in person," he said. Alyssa smiled and leaned over to kiss him again. "And that's for you, you jaded, bad-tempered old ranger." A little surprised by her own impulsiveness, she urged her horse ahead of him. Halt touched one hand to his cheek and looked after the slim, blond figure. "If I were 20 years younger," he began. Then he sighed and had to be honest with himself. Make that 30 years, he thought.